Hello, I'm Alan Mabon, and welcome to this event. It's part of the 2022 Imagine Belfast Festival of Ideas and Politics. I'm joined today by Helen Thompson. She's been studying geopolitical movements, economic changes, largely fed by oil and gas, and democratic shifts around the world. So far this century, apparently, central banks have created over $25 trillion of new money. I would like that magic money tree in the back of my garden. While geopolitical tectonic plates have continued to kind of shift and jar against each other, and the European Union looks a bit less united than it was before, and energy production and costs are proving very disruptive and are in our news all the time now. Helen's analysis is contained in her new book, Disorder, Hard Times in the 21st Century. But it's not the first time she's put pen to paper to talk about oil and economics. She's a regular on the Talking Politics podcast, and her writing appears frequently in the New Statesman, as well as places like the New York Times, Financial Times, and way, way beyond. Helen, you're very, very welcome to Imagine Festival.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alan, absolutely.
Your day job is being Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge University. What makes a political economist? What makes them tick?
Well, that's a good question. The first thing to say is that I don't really think of myself as a political economist. I prefer to think of myself as someone who studies the political economy of the world, because I think if you're an economist, you have a particular set of methods that you bring to bear upon economic questions, and a lot of it in contemporary economics anyway is about sort of modelling the economic world, and that's not what I do. I'm interested in the politics of the economic world, and I'm interested in that in terms of the national politics, the domestic politics of countries, and I'm interested in the geopolitics of the world economy, and I'm interested in the way in which the geopolitics and the domestic politics of the world economy interact with each other. And what is true is I think that over the last maybe certainly 7 or 8 years, maybe 10, I've got more and more interested in the geopolitics of it, in good part because I think the world economy has become considerably more geopolitical over the last 10 years.
And so the premise of Disorder as a book is really kind of trying to plait together the three strands of what was happening geopolitically, what's happening with the economy, and then what's happening with kind of democracy and democratic kind of changes. So it's like, is it like playing three-dimensional chess? Because a change in one dimension kind of it upsets the play on the other dimensions as well.
No, I think that is quite a bit how I thought about it, is I was trying to understand what was going on really in the middle of the 2010s, particularly around 2016 and the shocks, Brexit and Donald Trump's election, also the failed coup in Turkey that year. And it seemed to me that actually, in some sense, the disruption was bouncing around from both place to place in a country by country sense, but also that it was bouncing around from sphere to sphere. So it was bouncing around from what was going on in economies to what was going on geopolitically to what was going on in national politics. I mean, to just give you an example, as I was writing a book about oil, a short book about oil, during the course of the 2016 Brexit referendum, I had a sense that actually some of the things that had happened in regard to oil, particularly the extremely high oil prices in 2011, and the different ways in which the Bank of England and the European Central Bank had responded to those high oil prices, had actually played their part in the referendum, obviously in quite a complicated causal manner. But I still thought that it was better to try to understand how all the moving parts, so to speak, had interacted with each other to explain those shocks, rather than to just say, okay, Brexit's simply about Britain's membership of the European Union. And I actually thought it was, in some sense, that was a slightly parochial take on what was happening, because there were bigger shifts going on.
And is it true? I mean, the film Dune last year, which is kind of picking up BAFTAs and may pick up some Oscars and things in a few weeks or months' time. Spice is the kind of the resource that is everybody wants to trade, is what people are willing to kill themselves or kill each other for. Oil and gas really are today's version of that, aren't they? I mean, you can claim that you've got lots of gold in reserve, but actually having oil in the ground or oil pipelines or gas pipelines, that's where the real money seems to kind of go around the world. Is that that's central to your argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that Dune, that in some sense is kind of like an allegory where oil is concerned. in that respect. I think that it's not possible to understand the 20th century, the history of the 20th century, in geopolitical terms or in economic terms without giving oil a pretty big part in the story. And aside from anything else, it was possible, as you say, Alan, for some people, not least the oil traders that really took off in the 1990s, to earn an enormous amount of money from this, but to earn an enormous amount of money in ways that actually depended upon their understanding of the geopolitical risks that are in play. Javier Glass has written a great book. Has written a great book about this, The World for Sale, that's just gone out in a paperback edition. And some of the stories are pretty hair-raising in terms of the impact that these oil traders had.
Helen, in one of the early chapters, you kind of take us through the history, I suppose the geopolitical history. We have America that is quite oil rich at the beginning, but then starts to kind of it needs to find partnerships and security and I guess cash from the Middle East. So it's kind of its oil interests go from its own shores to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big change that happens really in the 1970s. Is that the United States until that point has been largely self-sufficient in oil, has enough domestic supply to take care of its own needs. It's had some scares before then, but it's never been in a position where it's been a significant importer of oil. But what happens in 1970 is that American oil production peaks. It never reaches that same level again until the shale oil boom in the 2010s. And from that point on, from that year, the United States is on a trajectory to becoming the world's largest oil importer because, after all, it is the world's largest oil consumer. And that means that it has a foreign energy dependency problem, and it really struggles to get to grips with that, particularly in the 1970s. It finds itself subject to a succession of energy shocks like other Western economies. And it means that it needs to have a much more coherent policy in the Middle East than it is hitherto done. But it struggles to have such a policy, and things are made a lot worse by the end of that decade by the Iranian Revolution, which leaves the Americans pretty dependent upon Saudi Arabia.
And this just starts to kind of build up what was already there from 50, 100 years ago. But you have those big super blocks all kind of vying for advantage, but also then vying to nearly own the countries that they channel production through. So it becomes, I mean, it's very easy to believe as you read the book, in a sense, that actually that energy economy thing and the geopolitics go so hand in hand at that point.
No, and the other big thing that happened in the 1970s is that Britain leaves the Middle East. Its empire in the Middle East is over, and British ongoing imperial presence in the Middle East had been a pretty important part of the first 3 decades of the post-war period. In some sense, I think it's fair to say that Western energy security in the Middle East until 1971, when the British left, depended upon the British Empire. And that came to an end at the same time as American oil production was peaking and the United States was about to become a large oil importer. And the consequence of the final retreat of the European empires from the Middle East was energy nationalism. It was, in some sense, the energy nationalism of the 1970s. State-owned energy firms was the corollary of decolonization. Is that the Arab countries in Iran were going to control the oil resources in their country for themselves. And that meant that they pushed out the big Western oil majors, as they were called. And they found, particularly, obviously, Saudi Arabia in 1973, that they could use oil as a geopolitical weapon in terms of their conflict with Israel. And that poses a whole set of other difficulties for the United States in trying to get to grips with all this. So there's a fundamental shift in the geopolitical balance of power, I would say, away from Western countries in the 1970s. In the 1990s, there's an attempt by the United States, I think, to reassert Western interests in the Middle East, this time by the United States itself exercising military power. So the first Gulf War going through into the early 2000s and the second Gulf War. But as we know, that turns out in the end to go pretty spectacularly wrong from the American point of view. So we're back to, by the beginning of 2010s, then the United States having a pretty incoherent position in the Middle East.
And is it fair to say that kind of democratically, that some of the countries that have the greatest either natural resources that have fossil fuels kind of that they're able to pump them out of the ground or find them, that those are also the ones that are either very democratic light or they're very unstable democratically, which feeds, I guess, into your disorder kind of argument and model that says the people with power also are struggling to kind of use it wisely.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line from the 1970s onwards is that the preponderance of oil in particular, but to a considerable extent gas as well, lies either in the Middle East, where there are set, as we know, of authoritarian regimes of one kind or another, Israel accepted, and Israel is not an oil-producing country, and in what was then the Soviet Union and what is now Russia. And so in a world in which not only the Western European countries need to import oil, but the United States does too, that is kind of the choice. Now, to some extent, that was lessened in the latter part of the 70s and the 1980s by the rise of North Sea oil production, by the rise of production in Alaska, and increased production in Mexico. But really, I would say by the early 2000s, all those new productions from the late 70s, 80s are in decline. And so the world goes back to a situation of dependency upon the oil reserves in the Middle East and Russia, and to some extent Venezuela, though Venezuelan oil is quite difficult to use in a number of respects. And just to make matters even more complicated by this point, so in the middle of the 2000s, we've got China's economic development, and China is, from that point, from the early 2000s, using a lot more oil. It needs to import it because it's China. So its oil self-sufficiency had ended in 1993. So what we see by 2005 is constrained oil production, much higher demand, and unsurprisingly, this leads to a massive increase in prices. So prices reached their highest ever level in the middle of 2008 as a result of all this.
And so I'm going to kind of steer the conversation towards Ukraine in a few minutes' time, and there may be some questions that come in from the audience that will kind of feed through into that as well. But can we talk about the UK for a minute? Because you've kind of touched on it there in terms of North Sea oil reserves. There is a sense that the UK sees itself as a superpower. It sees itself as having kind of military strategy, if not actual might. It has a seat on the UN Security Council, which it thinks often gives it some clout, but maybe today we would say, depending on who else is in the Security Council, you can't do much. Is the UK kind of those struggling energy-wise to actually have, enough power, enough actual resource to be a player? Is it getting left behind now that actual energy consumption is the big thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in lots of ways, North Sea oil cushioned Britain through the 1980s. It's quite difficult to see how Mrs. Thatcher's governments could have pursued some of the economic policies in which that they did without the protection that North Sea oil gave to the British, the UK balance of payments. I think that the one sort of advantage from the North Sea oil phase that the UK had is that it didn't acquire such a significant dependency upon Russian oil or gas as most other Europe, or at least many other European countries did. But as North Sea oil and gas have gone into decline, the UK's got a problem like everybody else in terms of foreign fossil fuel energy dependency. It has been willing, unlike say Germany, to import quite a lot of shale gas from the United States. It also imports gas from Qatar. But I think that what we should expect to see in the United Kingdom over the next few years is quite a bit of political pressure through parts of the Conservative Party on trying to encourage UK shale development, exploration, and then production, because the option of dealing with the decline in North Sea oil and gas by turning to Russia, which I think was part of what was going on even in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
If you looked at the volume that was starting to come in, particularly on the oil side, that's really closed off now. So I expect to see quite a bit of pressure for we need to start fracking in the UK, which is a position that until now the Conservative government or Johnson's government has been opposed to.
Yeah, and our local Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive have kind of managed to mostly stick to that line as well. But yeah, there does seem to be much more emphasis on even people kind of saying, can we not get more coal? Can we not start kind of bring that back and not looking for other solutions? Maybe later on we'll talk about, I guess, kind of whether if you have lithium mines in your country, that now you're a target, or maybe you'll become the next kind of oil producing nation by kind of helping with batteries and things. But if this was a kind of work of fiction, I'd be getting you to kind of read a kind of a lovely chapter to entice us into the book, and maybe about how Maggie fell in love with Ronald, or how Angela could speak to Vladimir in his own tongue, or how Boris travelled to Saudi Arabia but underestimated Mohammed bin Salman. But instead, I think we're going to drop into the middle of page 66, or the top of page 66. So it's a bit about the geopolitics of Eurasia, and it starts to touch on some things that seemed very contemporary as I read it over the weekend. Anyway, I'll let you kind of read for a few minutes there, and then we'll pick up the conversation and any of the questions.
Thanks very much, Alan. So this is a bit, I'm going to read essentially about what happened to the European Union in the wake of its enlargement eastwards after the end of the Cold War. In 2004, the EU did finally welcome 8 new members, including Poland. But Eastern EU enlargement was still bedeviled by security matters. If the French feared it would compromise the EU as a security confederation, they took the Second Iraq War as vindication of their apprehension. In the weeks before the war began, Chirac described the East European government's support for the American position on Iraq as infantile, and said they were, quote, missing an opportunity to shut up. Ukraine was pivotal for these EU-NATO fault lines. Ukraine formally became an independent state with the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, but its strategic importance around the Black Sea made for an uneasy separation. In 1997, Russia and Ukraine agreed to divide the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet, based at Sevastopol in Crimea. Under this treaty, the new Russian Black Sea Fleet was able to use Sevastopol for 20 years and station troops on the Crimean Peninsula. If this treaty effectively guaranteed Ukrainian independence, subject to Russian military rights in Crimea, it lacked meaningful external support, since neither the EU nor NATO membership were on offer to Ukraine. Indeed, the EU formally ruled out EU entry when, after its 2004 enlargement, it set out a European neighbourhood policy for relations with the states between the Baltic republics and the Black Sea, the Caucasus, North Africa, and the Middle East that excluded further accessions. The 2004-5 Orange Revolution brought the Ukraine dilemma to its first crisis. Massive demonstrations after the presidential election in November 2004, which appeared rigged in favour of the pro-Russian candidate, led the Ukrainian Supreme Court to order a rerun, then won by Viktor Yushchenko on a pro-EU platform. On taking office in January 2005, Yushchenko promised that securing EU membership would be the alpha and omega for his government, and that he would take Ukraine into NATO. The enlarged EU was now beset with a geopolitical divide around Ukraine. A union that included Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, states that border Ukraine, ensured there would be persistent internal pressure to offer a substantially closer economic relationship. But since an EU that took Ukraine into its economic orbit would have to endure more confrontational relations with Russia, and thus this move would need to be coupled with NATO accession, France would continue to resist.
So thanks for that, because the good news is that although the book went to print and probably was finalised long before we kind of realised what was going to happen in terms of Russia invading Ukraine, the signs were there of its strategic importance and it's the disruptability, the disorder that it was kind of sitting on top of. Were you surprised, I suppose, as an educated academic who's looking at this area, were you surprised when you realised what was kind of heating up this year, and then what has happened since?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been paying attention through last year, and really from the point in last spring when the Russian military build-up began. Mm-hmm. And I thought that it was a mistake of the Biden administration to end the sanctions on Nord Stream, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I should say, which he did. So you could see that the situation in terms of Putin's confidence about what might be achieved and his assumption that actually the NATO's resolve and the American resolve in particular wasn't that strong. I think there was a short-term history to that. I think it was also notable that Putin's speeches on the subject of Ukraine started to move into different territory. They started to really, I think there was one he gave last summer, or no, it was a long article I think that he wrote during the course of the summer, in which he just like fundamentally rejected any idea of Ukrainian nationhood, but and just denied that it exists in any way, that the Ukrainians in his mind are just a subset of Russians. And so that seemed to me to be quite different from the things that he'd been saying about Ukraine, let's say in relation to the 2014 Ukraine crisis, when Russia ended up annexing Crimea, which was much more focused on sort of geopolitical issues, both the position of Sevastopol as a port and also the transit issue of the pipelines through Ukraine. If you say to me, though, did I really contemplate the idea that he was going to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine with the apparent intention of partitioning Ukraine, and that he would be willing to use Russian artillery against Ukrainian citizens in the way in the way in which he had? I can't say that I saw that coming, and I was pretty shocked by the scale of what he's been willing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I put a military strategist on the radio about 3 or 4 weeks ago, just on the eve of this happening, and effectively mutually assured appeasement was the answer at that point, the most likely thing that he felt was going to happen. And I think we all felt pretty foolish and also pretty sad and kind of shocked 3 days later when we kind of saw really where this was going to go, or at least how quickly it was going to go. In terms of there's kind of two things in my head here. One, you mentioned about France. We'll come back to that. But in terms of the role of NATO, because I mean, NATO is one of your kind of geopolitical kind of groupings. I mean, it's in a sense it's a military group, but it's also practically a pseudo-political organization as well. It's complicated. And did we kind of misunderstand it for a long time because it wasn't doing as much and it wasn't as relevant to kind of everyday politics? Or it strikes me that kind of the North American bit, we kind of forget that North America is not kind of Northwest Europe, and maybe we forgot where its heritage lay or where its power lay. But it's quite a disruptor. It causes a lot of disorder through your narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's two stories here in a way. There's one that's runs through the Cold War years when NATO's formed, and that is that NATO can never get to grips with the Middle East problem, and it needs, in some sense, to get to grips with the Middle East problem because that is an energy security interest first for the Western Europe and then for the United States. And part of why it struggles to get to grips with the Middle East problem is it can't get to grips with the Turkey problem. Turkey, being a NATO member, though not in the first group of countries that formed NATO, but there always being some disquiet, shall we say, in a number of West European capitals, and particularly perhaps Paris and Berlin and Brussels, at the not necessarily the complete inclusion of NATO, but whether they really were wanting to defend, the inclusion of Turkey, but whether they really were willing to defend Turkey in the case of an invasion of Turkey. And that issue then, if you move out of the Cold War years into the post-Cold War years, turns up in 2003 during the Iraq War, where those three countries really object to the plans that NATO makes for defending Turkey during the second Iraq war. So that seems to me an issue, the Middle East and Turkey, that runs through the Cold War years and it runs into the post-Cold War years, and it's still there now. Then there's the post-Cold War issue, and that's really about the position of the Eastern European countries and ultimately Ukraine. And the basic formula, it looks to me, for dealing with Eastern European countries in relation to NATO and the EU was either they join NATO first and then they join the European Union, like Poland and Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, or they join NATO and the EU at the same time, which is the case of the Baltic republics. The problem for Ukraine was that neither of these things were on offer. And then in 2009, the EU moved towards essentially offering negotiations for associate membership for Ukraine. They reached an agreement with the Ukrainian government. But when then Yanukovych changed tack because the Russia was offering much more financial support at a moment when Ukraine was stuck in a financial crisis, and then there was the domestic uprising against that. When Putin played his hand, which was to use the Russian military position in the fact there were military Russian soldiers in Crimea, in the way in which I just described from the reading, is that the EU got nothing left no card left to play, because it kind of, if you're going to do something that is as provocative to Russia as Russia took that to be, I'm not judging, I'm not saying that was acceptable from Putin's point of view. I'm just saying that is the way that he behaved, and that you not got any security commitment to Ukraine, then the Russians win. And so I think that there was a complete muddle in understanding what the relationship was between NATO and the EU. Well, at least as it turned out in relation to Ukraine, and not seeing that actually there were still security risks for the independent states that emerged between Germany and Russia once the Cold War came to an end and the dissolution of the Soviet Union took place.
And there's a sense that France plays it's quite uncomfortable reading, in a sense, because you kind of realise its relationship with NATO and how aligned it wants to really be with NATO is clearly a problem, but it also stands in the way of other countries kind of speeding up their entry into NATO and the EU as well, in terms of, so it kind of France is playing an interesting game, probably domestic as well as international.
Yeah, I mean, the French story is interesting because obviously, if you go back to the 1960s, when Charles de Gaulle was president of France, that he withdrew France from the joint command of NATO in the middle of the 1960s, and France didn't rejoin the joint command of NATO until 2009, I think it was. And France was never keen on the enlargement of NATO eastwards. It was never really very keen on the enlargement of the European Union eastwards. And the reasons for this was because it thought that French presidents thought that it would dilute the EU's sense of geopolitical purpose. And part of that is that for France is that the EU geopolitically, I'm talking about now for France before the events of the last few weeks, needs to be focused on the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean as well. And anything that is focused on the Russia question and Eastern Europe dilutes attention away from what it wants the focus of the EU to be, as wanted the focus of the EU to be geopolitically. And that this is set up, I think, what was a pretty deep division both within the EU and within NATO, and you might schematize it as like the Polish view versus the view in Paris, and that at times it's been pretty consequential, including, I would say, in 2018, 2019, over in relations between France and Germany over how to deal with what Turkey was doing in the Eastern Mediterranean.
And are we looking at it as kind of a world that disorder, there will be a lot more disorder of the nature that we're seeing at the moment if the kind of accession plans to actually join EU or NATO are not speeded up. So in a sense, they nearly have to make a decision soon that you either get in 5 years, but saying that it could take 20 years to join is kind of unrealistic, given that the speed that kind of geopolitics is kind of changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of sort of promises have been made about, or a lot of rhetorical promises will be made to Ukraine about EU accession, and I think it will be an incredibly difficult thing to bring about. And one of in a way, the tragedies of the Ukraine story is the way in which both EU membership and NATO membership have been dangled in front of Ukrainians at various times when nobody's actually meant it. I mean, even if you go back to when the Bush administration, the George Bush Jr. administration, was pushing membership of NATO for Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. I mean, it's got to be a really open, say that they succeeded, it's got to be a really open question about whether the American electorate has really got the will to tolerate, essentially, to put it crudely, body bags coming back from Europe to fight for Ukraine's independence. And that's what actually of NATO saying yes to Ukraine and Georgian membership in 2008 would have meant. Yet at the same time, even in the last year or so, Joe Biden was never willing to shut the door on NATO membership for Ukraine. It was in time. It encouraged Ukraine to believe that something could happen that I don't think there ever was any realistic chance that it could.
Yeah, I spent some time in Macedonia when it was kind of going through the referendum to change to be North Macedonia to stop that kind of war with, the kind of war of words with Greece as to who owned the word Macedonia. Was it a region of Greece? Was it a whole country? But part of that deal, in a sense, was starting to join NATO, starting to join the EU, starting to put distance between Macedonia and Russia, which seems a very, very, very far way away. You've got to go up through the kind of the Baltics into lots of other countries before you reach Russia. But the feeling that it was around and was kind of wanted to be involved, but that was kind of dangled in front of the voters as something that was, it was very possible, and it was very, it would be very good for them to kind of vote for. And yet, actually, today that feels very. I kind of see that very differently, because you kind of realise, gosh, your chances of actually seeing that dream come true are quite low. It could be a very long time, and yet I can see why kind of Russian dominance in the area, or the ease that with which Russia could extend its tentacles, even to somewhere small. So it's barely bigger than Northern Ireland in terms of population. It's a real threat. So
I mean, the thing, in the Macedonia case, obviously, is they change the name and they go through all the pain of that, and then Macron vetoes the accession talks. It was quite I think in all the things that have happened in the last few years, that little episode's got forgotten about quite a lot. But it caused a serious row between Macron and on Merkel. I mean, she kind of leaked out that she was entirely fed up with this. She, put it, Macron going around smashing things up, and then she had to clear the mess up afterwards. Also, that they could have a cup of tea afterwards and discuss it. I mean, it's a really, it was really Macron putting a marker down of saying that he did not want the EU to enlarge again, and he was doing it to a country that had made a significant sacrifice to get to the point in which it had, where accession was concerned.
Yeah, and if we count the number of helicopters with world leaders, or so very senior NATO figures, very senior EU figures from Germany and even the UK arriving in that city, a capital city, as they were having the kind of referendum, you kind of realised, yeah, but not everybody was actually lined up behind them. I do see all of that with a whole different perspective 3 years later. We have a question here coming in from one of the viewers, Alexander Rushford, who asks, to what extent are we now seeing a realignment of geopolitics in the Middle East, particularly with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, how they've reacted to the Russian invasion? So, I mean, are we seeing a bit of a realignment there? Is it too early to see just exactly how that will finish?
It may be, but I think what's really important here to see is that a fundamental realignment in the Middle East took place in 2016, when the Saudis and the Russians made it up with each other, to put it quite simply, and they did so because the Saudi attempt to basically both bankrupt American shale oil producers, and at the same time to put pressure on Putin to withdraw, or to lessen Russian support for the Assad regime in Syria. And then after he had ordered Russian military intervention in Syria to withdraw from Syria, that failed. And so the Saudis couldn't tolerate low prices themselves any longer. So they made a pact with Russia, what became now known as OPEC plus, in which the second and the third largest oil producers of the world, the United States being the first, would cooperate with each other to control the prices. And one of the questions then that the Russian invasion of Ukraine raised was, well, how are the Saudis going to react to that? Are they going to be sufficiently attuned to American sensitivities to, if not immediately pull the plug on OPEC plus, to at least perhaps contemplate it, move in that direction, shall we say? And what we've seen thus far is there's no evidence that that is happening, and partly I think is the consequence of the fact of how bad relations between the Biden administration and the Saudi government have been. But what the United Arab Emirates has done in the last few days is pretty significant here, because I've invited Assad to the UAE. It's the first significant visit that Assad's made to an Arab country since the Syrian civil war began. The UAE was initially a supporter of the rebels in Syria. That's quite, and given that the Assad regime is supported by Russia, that's quite a statement for the UAE to make, to invite Assad at this particular moment in time. So unless the Americans have got a counter move that we haven't seen yet to try to split the Saudis and their Arab allies from Russia over OPEC plus, then I think that what we are seeing is the ways in which the non-Western parts of the world are detaching from Western concerns where Russia, in terms of what Russia is doing.
And we see that with China as well, because I mean, there's a sense of they have to make a decision, or they are in the process of making decisions about just which way they're going to lean, or what kind of with the mood music of who they will want to support with either economic help or military help, or kind of just providing things for it. I mean, China is a huge energy consumer. It's effectively the factory that produces all the parts that make all the things that everybody in the rest of the world wants to consume. So they're a really important economy, but they're kind of quite an interesting, quite a powerful position at the moment to kind of change the next decade or two of world history, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that China does in this respect, where Russia's concerned, is it just provides such a big alternative market for Russia than Europe, as actually increasingly does India too, another country that's not been willing to align itself with the Western position over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I think that China has some vulnerabilities as well where energy is concerned. It's got an acute foreign energy dependency problem. It has to worry about the possibility that the United States could one day use its navy to make it more difficult anyway for oil to be imported from the Persian Gulf and Africa, particularly through the Strait of Malacca. But we can see, going back, I would say, at least all the way to the Second Iraq War, a sense in Russia and in Moscow and Beijing that their energy interests are complementary with each other. And Russia has benefited from China's economic development and China's energy demand. And China has been able to take advantage of Russian oil and Russian gas, and thus not get in a position where it's that dependent upon American energy imports, which it absolutely would not want to be the case. And meanwhile, obviously, there are other ways in which China's economy has become pretty important. I think it's become pretty important in Europe after 2008, much higher levels of exports to European countries, and at least until 2016, much higher levels of investment as well. And we saw then in the end of 2020, when Macron and Merkel pushed the comprehensive agreement, the EU's comprehensive agreement on investment with China just before Biden took over the presidency, that issue has the issue of the EU's relationship with China and the role in which France and Germany play in shaping the EU's policy has got the potential both to be quite internally divisive within the European Union and to be divisive in terms of transatlantic relations as well.
So it turns out it's one to watch, because it's not. It could go many different directions over the next while.
Absolutely, because at the same time that Merkel and Macron got that agreement, but it hasn't been ratified because of the reaction that then took in the reaction in particularly by people in the European Parliament, both to China's behaviour in Hong Kong and to the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang.
Is there a sense that if you kind of, depending on where you are in the world, depending on where your map is centred, essentially you read into the geopolitics of this in a different way? I mean, if you're kind of reading your book in China or India or maybe even the global south, do you think there'll be kind of significantly different perspectives on explaining the story? I'm not trying to get you to critique your own analysis, but
no, I absolutely think there would
but
be.
I'm assuming you're kind of aware of the fact that you're writing this as somebody who lives and works in England, and so that kind of just what we consume and what we see and how we think probably changes the story slightly. But if you shifted east or south, there might be slightly different views on it.
I think there'd be very different views. I mean, I took the decision when writing the book not to try to transcend in that sense where I was sitting. That this is a book that starts from the shocks as they are experienced in the West. It tries to understand that other parts of the world have profound impacts on what happens here, but it's not an attempt to try and see the world from their point of view geopolitically. I think that one of the things, I think I say this in one of the footnotes to the introduction, that I don't really engage with, and I think that, you know, if I'd written a longer book and had more time, etc., I would have done, is the India story and all this. I knowingly underplayed the way in which India's integration into the world economy has been an important part of the story of the world economy over the last 30 years or so, and also the way in which India matters in terms of how the China-Russia issue plays out. And indeed, I think you could see that the Biden administration has been quite tolerant to India thus far in saying, look, we do understand that you have security interests in relation to Russia and that you're interested in using Russia in terms of balancing China. And given that, you know, in the terms of the Quad, that the US is in some kind of security relationship in the Pacific with India, along obviously with Japan and Australia, is I think that we can see that the calculus looks very different in India than it does if you're sitting in a European country or indeed in Washington. I've also, you know, like knowingly not spent, in fact, scarcely any time whatsoever on Africa, except for a little bit about the French position in North Africa. But again, Africa's going to be a pretty important part of the energy story in particular, because, you know, we can talk in Western countries about we need to use less energy, but that's not the name of the game in African countries. Extraordinarily, understandably, is because economic development means using more energy, and they're still pursuing a much higher level of economic development. So the choices about climate change and what to do about the energy transition, they don't look the same when you're sitting in an African country than when you're sitting like where I am, you know, in the United Kingdom.
And presumably, if we kind of head the energy bits, I think one of the things that fascinates me about the book, just because, in a sense, you can nearly say kind of money equals or energy equals money at this point. But as we look towards less reliance on fossil fuels, that slightly tips the balance towards countries which have lots of lithium to be mined for batteries and things. That would explain Chinese interest in some of those countries, the amount of investment in some African countries by China, which is some aid organisations are already kind of flagging up as they're quite worried about if we all want to drive electric cars in the West, who's actually suffering and what's the consequences of that. Do you think, is there a point where actually some of those raw materials become the new spice? You know, they become the new oil, the new gas, or are we still way too wedded to the old kind of fossil fuels that actually it'll be a long time before something else takes over?
Well, I actually think both things are going to be happening at the same time. I mean, I think that the energy transition is going to be quite long, but it is going to happen, or at least that there's going to be a lot more green energy, you know, produced than there has been in the past, and that, as you say, Alan, is going to involve geopolitical competition for the extraction of metals and the distribution and supply chains around metals. And at the moment, China is in a very advantageous position, both in terms of the rare earth metals that are under the earth in China, and its present dominance of the supply chains around metal mining, extraction, distribution. But I don't think that any of that means that the old fossil fuel geopolitical dynamics are going away. If you look at the way in which historically energy transitions take place, is that the new energy is added to the volume of energy. It doesn't replace.
Yes.
And the one place where you can see that things are changing is coal. But again, not even in all countries where coal is concerned. The United Kingdom is a place where there's much less coal used than used to be.
And yet, it was in the news the other day that there was a huge lot of coal got brought into Northern Ireland. It's suspected for some of the power stations that are still coal-based.
Yeah.
And so there was kind of a feeling of, where did that coal come from? Well, guess. But it didn't technically come in on a Russian boat. It probably was dumped from one to another to allow it to be kind of, and you're kind of going, okay, the energy crisis, even in Northern Ireland, is very complicated politically.
I mean, the thing that I have to say I didn't really take on board until the last few months is how much coal, for instance, how much coal Germany imports from Russia. I mean, the German energy dependency, fossil fuel energy dependency, is usually cast in terms of oil and gas, but actually it's coal. Yeah. It's coal as well, despite the fact it is a country that historically has had an abundant domestic supply. And I think that is really why it's very difficult to dislodge Russia's energy geopolitical power, because it goes across all three of the fossil fuels. And there are, at the moment in the world, supply constraints generated for different reasons around each of them. And we would all like to, I think, to live in a world in which we weren't importing fossil fuels from regimes that we really morally, abhor.
But Lindsay has a question that's kind of related here that's come in. Is it not the case, and this is kind of, I think, probably looking back to when we were kind of talking about fracking and so on, and so on, but is it not the case that fracking in the UK isn't really economically viable? Because even with rising gas prices, the investment timescale is far too long, commodity prices are too unstable, so I suppose saying in the short to medium term it's not worth doing. But is it worth doing in the longer term? Is that where the pressure will come politically to allow it?
I mean, I think that it's highly unlikely that we're going to see a significant fall in gas prices again. So I think we're more likely now to be living in an era of, if not permanently high commodity prices, at least where the baseline level is high. They won't stay high, because once you have enough, prices have risen high enough, they simply destroy the demand for the energy source concerned. I mean, it's certainly true that shale fracking generally requires a conducive financial environment. For a long time in the United States, it was produced without the shale producers being able to turn in a profit. It was propped up essentially by the monetary environment that the Federal Reserve had created after 2008, because you just had investors that were desperate for a return and were willing to buy the junk bonds that were being issued by the shale energy companies. So you need a credit environment to support shale. At the same time is that you don't actually know whether the potential for fracking in this country would actually deliver anything like the volume that the figures that are sometimes talked about. I mean, if you looked in the sort of early to middle 2010s, the great hope for those who were committed to fracking was Poland. That was where it was supposed to be. Big fields, big wells would be. It would be possible to do large scale fracturing of the rocks, but when they were doing it at a small scale level, the rocks didn't produce gas and oil in the same way in which they did in the United States. I mean, this is not something that you just say, okay, we think there
no
might be shale
guarantees.
here, and then you just pull a few levers, and that's what happens. It doesn't work like that. But I think that what will change is that what has been largely politically taboo in the UK for a while now, that political taboo will break. Now, whether that actually turns into economically viable fracking, whether the is the potential for anything like a shale boom in this country, that I think is very much open to question.
That's above the pay grade of a former mathematician, IT person, or a political economist to come back with. Final kind of question, really, I suppose, is around where do you see disorder coming from in the future? Is it any different to where it is today? And disorder, you don't think is a bad thing? I mean, it's kind of an inevitability of complexity. Rather, it's not good or bad. It's just it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of like where I would see some immediate, well, I think the big source of disorder in the future will be the energy transition, because it's such a momentous thing for us to try to do, necessary, absolutely necessary, as it is. You know, we are trying with net zero 2050 to fundamentally change the energy source of our whole way of life. And there's nothing really that's comparable to that in human history. Even I think would say the industrial revolution. So that will have lots of consequences economically, geopolitically, and in terms of the politics of distribution in democracies, and it will push in the direction of, in some sense, a politics of sacrifice that I don't think democracies are very well equipped to deal with. If you say to me, like, where do I think the next sort of site of serious geopolitical tension will be, I think one place for sure will be the Eastern Mediterranean. And we could already see that in 2018-19, and that is an issue about Turkey. Turkey has an acute foreign energy dependency problem. It has a president who talks some fairly, like hair-raising revisionist language about who owns what in the Mediterranean. That Turkey's engaged in, like military interventions in the last few years in Syria and in Libya. It supported Azerbaijan in its successful mini war with, with Armenia. Turkey's a regional player that's asserting itself quite significantly, and it's in a weak position where energy is concerned. And they're all, I think, reasons as to why we should expect considerable turbulence around Turkey over the next few years, particularly as European countries try to get away from Russian gas dependency. The most immediate best prospects lie in the East Mediterranean. In terms of disorder, I mean, I think that disorder is more the norm than order. I mean, there are periods of like order, and obviously the period from what's called the post-war era from 1945 to, let's say, 1971 is usually taken to be one of those. But one of the things that I wanted to show in the geopolitical part of this book was that period of order, was dependent upon the British acting in an imperial fashion in the Middle East, and a fairly incoherent situation between the US and Britain over that relationship. And I think that there are times when it's quite easy for many people, particularly perhaps on the left, to idealize the post-war era as an era of like full employment, higher economic growth, creation of the welfare state, this stuff. And all that stuff's true. It doesn't take away from this, but there's another story too, and it's one that's a bit less morally palatable about what underpinned the Western way of life during those decades.
Yeah. On the back cover, my go-to economist, Diane Coyle, says that there could be no better guide than Helen Thompson, good news, to the turbulence of the 21st century. Calls it a magisterial book that brings into focus the key structural forces driving not only recent events, but also the inevitable changes still to come. I'm very fond of, I've learned a lot kind of reading Disorder over the last few weeks, or the last few days. So Helen, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you today, to kind of hear a little bit more about where it goes, and best wishes with writing more and finding more disorder everywhere you look, because I have a funny feeling that's nearly inevitable. Also, lots more events at Imagine Festival this week. We've got Hannah White coming up on Tuesday talking about Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons. Veteran journalist Bill Neely is speaking on Thursday evening. And on Saturday, there's a battle of ideas at Ulster University that will challenge, annoy, and maybe even make you think. Plus lots of theatre, talks, walks, seminars, concerts, and much, much more on imaginebelfast.com. But if we can virtually thank Helen for coming here today and also kind of challenging us and also educating us through the book Disorder. Best wishes, Helen, for the next term, and all the best to everybody who has been with us today at Imagine Belfast. See you soon.